Ladies and gentlemen, let us continue our dungeon reviews, shall we? Let's jump into what is kind of a remake, but not really. It is the Big Brother or Everbloom 2.0. It is Darkheart Thicket. Yes, indeed, you will look upon this place and say, I kind of see what this place is, and you are right. It is exactly taken pretty much from the Everbloom, including one of the bosses, which is due to his nature of being a big tree, spoilers, is in fact taken pretty much from Everbloom and has very similar mechanics despite being in a different environment. Very cool. This is one of the most aesthetically pleasing dungeons in Legion. It looks fantastic. There's so much work and detail going into this place. It's almost absurd. It really is. You go in there and you're like, fuck me. It's so dense. I feel like a predator's gonna come out and molest my testicles at any moment. It really is that thick, and it feels thick. And on top of that, it's fucking huge. It's so big and sprawling and spread out, very similar to the Everbloom, which is a big dungeon, right? You're going all kinds of directions, but unfortunately, it still suffers from the same faults as the Everbloom. What I will say on this, okay, not to cause a ruckus or anything, I'm not trying to be a downer on this, is I had my worst runs in the Darkheart Thicket. Not that I don't enjoy the Darkheart Thicket, there's a very distinct difference here, but I had my worst runs in there for a number of reasons, and they're kind of the same reasons that I have some pretty grim runs in the Everbloom, which might give you big hints as to why that is. So, what do we see in the Everbloom all the time? Skipping. Because it's so geographically laid out in a really pleasing way, and they're going for a certain look and a certain vision in there, what tends to happen, as you know, is people find ways to jump on ledges and skype. Because let's face facts, WoW doesn't have the best geometry. You know what I mean? We could jump up mountains as vanilla. It's perfectly possible to do that. And when you create really multi-leveled dungeons like this, it's definitely going to be a thing, especially when you're doing a lot of dense foliage. As soon as there's a gap, people look through it, and this place is very trash heavy. It is, but the trash is interesting. I think that's a fair comment. The trash is interesting. They do all kinds of mechanics, silencing bears, poisonous flowers, all that kind of stuff that sprawls out of you, and suddenly you feel like you're getting very much out of control if you're not careful with how you're doing damage and stuff. And it's designed to make the dungeon interesting and make you feel like you are in a dense jungle. That is definitely the environment and feeling they're going for. Now, when I said I had bad runs, is the guys who are, because of the way the system is set up in Legion so far, that you can't, that it seems wrong to level as a non-tank spec or a non-healer spec, right? Because your artifact power and the relics you get choices of, you can work around it, and I don't really see why the guys are doing this, but there are plenty of people, even if that's just the way they prefer to level, who are leveling through dungeons. That's all they're doing, is just running dungeons over and over and over and over again. Now, the Darkheart Thicket has many skips, including a full boss, which is never nice. I hate that. I really dislike optional bosses in 5-man dungeons because they're always going to get skipped really quickly and really early on in the life cycle and expansion, certainly in a normal mode. And there'll always be that guy who's like, please, can we do this boss? And everybody else in the group is like, oh, fuck off. I just want to get my final reward. And that is kind of made worse in Legion because the final bosses reward a good chunk of artifact power. Yeah? And people want that good chunk of artifact power. That's the main reason they're there. It's something they're always going to want. You know what I mean? They might not want loot in there, but they're always going to want that artifact power, at least for the foreseeable future, which means that very quickly they'll be done with the loot and they just want to get the dungeon over and done with. I would really prefer if the artifact power was tied to the earlier bosses, if you're going to include optional stuff, and the optional one actually gives more. That would make way more sense. Make that optional boss harder, which he isn't, unfortunately. I have managed to do him. But to make that more interesting by giving him more artifact power to give you, rather than the last boss. It makes sense that it's the last boss, because people will probably leave then. It's such a difficult balance, isn't it? It's such a difficult balance. If you give all that artifact power to the earlier bosses, then people will just leave after their bosses and not do the last one, and nobody wants to do the dungeon and not finish it, because then you don't get the end reward and the end loot and blah blah blah. So it's awkward, guys. It's really awkward, and I just wish it wasn't optional. So the skipping that's going on is everything you've seen from the Everbloom, and they really, I'm bringing this up because goddamn do they need to fix the geography and the geometry of the place. There's just no reason that there's so many skips need to exist. Not only do you skip a boss, you can skip like 2 rooms full of trash, then you can skip an entire, as I said, this dungeon is large, you can skip huge areas of trash, and by doing so you create evade bugs. And I've seen many runs, just in the beginning of the Legion Alpha, it was actually really fun to do this because people didn't really know what the fuck was going on. And when you're doing that, you're taking your time, you're weighing it up, and you're learning the dungeon, right? Which is the fun part of doing the dungeon. That experience is going to be destroyed for anybody who gets in there with somebody who's done this place before, particularly tanks, who are just going to just run through everything and just be like, don't touch anything, let me aggro them and let me jump off this cliff so I can evade bug everything. And you're like, I didn't want to come in here to run a fucking quarter-mile run, you know what I mean? It's not why I'm in the dungeon. There are various reasons I join a dungeon. It's not just to not do anything and run to the end of it. So I hope they fix that. I don't mind the skipping of trash and challenge modes. It makes total sense. That's part of the strategy, is picking when to use invisibility pots and stuff. That's all part of it. That's very cool. And as I said, the trash is really interesting. It is interesting. You have to deal with it all in different ways. And if you start mixing and matching it, so if you chain pull a couple of groups, you can end up in a real mess. Like, they designed the trash so well that an individual pack is quite easily dealt with. You know what I mean? You might struggle a little bit in the early days, but you're going to be able to deal with it. But if you mix in a different set of trash with that does completely different mechanics, the way they designed it is if you pull all those things, mixing those mechanics together really causes problems. So you'll have bears that cause like a widespread interrupt. At the same time, you'll have stacking dots that need dispelling on people, and you can't dispel it. And you're like, this fucking sucks, dude. And they've designed it in such a way that individually these trash packs are kind of okay. Mix them together though, and then you got a cocktail for some fucking disaster, right? This is a cum load coming all over your face. Which is great design, by the way. It's a wonderful, wonderful bit of design. Let's talk about the bosses then. The bosses are, for the most part, okay. They're definitely zerged down at the moment, which is a little bit of a shame. But that's the way it's supposed to be in normal mode. So I'm not going to complain too much. These dungeons are just a precursor. They're basically LFR towards the eventual challenge mode stuff you're going to do. So the first boss, although he's a druid and he has some bleeds and he has this ability to fill the room with like void zones, it's not too bad. But what you can certainly see is the environment itself. You've got to take yourself back a little bit, right? You've got to say, okay, I see what this boss does, and it doesn't pose much of a threat in normal mode. This dungeon's really easy. That's like the derpy way of looking at this. What you've got to do is, right, this dungeon's supposed to be easy, but what the fuck is this guy doing? And what could he do? If this was turned up a notch, what would that be like? And that's the interesting part. So, what you actually have is this cool moment where you can feel like, oh, this environment's actually really claustrophobic, right? Look how small this environment is. It's pretty small. And he does fill the area, so then you start to get the idea in the challenge mode, this thing's really going to turn the fuck up. This thing's going to be controlled positioning, which is I always love, where you can organize the group properly, because he throws the void zones at people. Kind of like Tyrant Valhari, actually. He's got very much a sort of baby's first Tyrant Valhari sort of moment going on, where you can absolutely see that when you do this thing properly, you're going to evolve certain mechanics for positioning and stuff, and I think that's really cool. And that continues on through the other bosses, where the mechanics are really sort of softy, so I don't want to go into mechanics. I said this is more of a review of do I enjoy the dungeon or not, and any suggestions we could make. So the other two bosses, including the optional one, they're, you know, they're okay. They definitely need more mechanics. And what I would say for both of them is that they need an extra mechanic at least, because the base mechanic, like, I'll give an example, not to spoil it too much, but the tree, he very much like the Everbloom, he'll put the roots down, and if you stand in the roots, you're going to get rooted, then you've got to kill the root, right? So you can imagine in the challenge world, that's going to do a hell of a lot of damage to you, and you need to avoid it, but you're already avoiding it anyway, and frankly, the room's big enough, so it's not a big deal, and I really hope that that's not the main mechanic. It needs more mechanics, and the same with the other boss. So let's talk about the last boss then. The last boss is going to be a fucking nightmare if they turn this thing up. We've got fucking AoE silence emitting from players. We have self-healing. We have priority target switching and cooldown usage, kind of like the Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, you know, with the last boss there, where, you know, you've got to kill the skellies and stuff. You have to switch and go ham big time. That's going to be turned up to fucking 11 in this dungeon, really badly. We've got ads, we've got everything in there, and we've got a very large room. And I don't know about you guys, but when I walk into a 5-man boss that has a huge room, I just think to myself, oh, fuck. This guy's going to do something fucking bananas, because this room is really big, and that means that you are going to be using this space in some manner, and I can't wait to see what they actually come up with, and hopefully, again, it needs new mechanics. So overall, my impression is right now, it's a lovely dungeon. It feels far too long, and it's far too easy on normal mode, which makes it a bit of a drudge. It does make it a bit of a drudge because it's just not interesting enough yet. The trash is more interesting than the bosses, and I hate that. I hate that the trash has a lot going on. You get to the boss and you're like, ugh, This fucking blows, right? This is like really boring. Where the trash was super interesting. So you've got trash that gives you like damage buffs, but it buffs the trash at the same time. So you're making that sort of decision there, risk reward. Is it worth us getting that damage buff to kill it quicker? Or is it not worth it because this is going to kill the tank, right? Which will become very interesting as we get into more difficult encounters. But the bosses in the normal mode, it feels really long, which is why people are promoting skipping. And skipping exists, and that needs to be fixed. Like, dramatically needs to be fixed. Super fast. They need to get on the case and make sure we don't have another Everbloom scenario where people are fucking hopping up walls and doing all this shit. Just block it off. Even if you put something really absurd in the way. Just block this off. Prevent that from happening. Make it so that mobs can't evade. Give them a path to actually reach you. That would be fine. As long as you could actually make it so people can't just run through huge waves of trash and then just bug it out on the edge of a cliff or something. Make it so that trash is fucking coming for you, man. It's coming for you and it's coming hard. That would fix it for me. That would fix it for me and stop all this so we had to actually deal with it in a way that isn't just gormlessly trying to skip it. So Darkheart Thicket gets a thumbs up from me. I love the look. I think people on lower end PCs might struggle a little bit in here. It's definitely one of those that pushes you. I mean, I had 100 FPS in there, but my PC is like a fucking monster, and it should be doing that kind of thing. But I certainly see people who are like lagging a lot more in there than they are in other dungeons, so that might be a concern. But it looks gorgeous. Almost too busy at times, really does. It's like there's so much environment going on, I can't tell what's the mobs and what's the environment. Which is a good sign of the detail they've gone into. So that's the Darkheart Thicket. Let us continue our little journey, guys.